A red bicycle lay on its side, in a quiet stretch of rural road. Not abandoned, not broken, just left there. July 23, 1972, near Woodinville, Washington. It was a narrow road lined with trees, quiet enough that unusual sounds should have carried. The bicycle was still intact. No sign of a crash, no scattered belongings, no clear reason it had been dropped at all. And that detail mattered, because when something interrupts a moment like that, it usually leaves a trace, a struggle, a witness, a reason. Here, there was none. Nearby, hidden just off the road, was a second discovery. A young woman, motionless. Her name was Jody Loomis. She was 20 years old. She had been riding that bicycle minutes earlier. Now the bike was lying there by itself, as if whatever happened had happened in seconds. No witnesses came forward. No one reported hearing anything unusual. No one saw who stopped her, which raised a question that would stay unanswered for decades. How does someone disappear from a quiet road without anyone noticing what took her? Jody Loomis was not someone who disappeared easily. She was 20 and beginning to build an adult life of her own. She worked part-time. She helped her family. She kept routines that people recognized. That mattered. People notice when someone dependable doesn't come home. They make absence noticeable. Jody lived with her family in Snohomish County. She stayed close to home, but not confined by it. She had independence. She used it carefully. That morning she chose something simple. A bike ride, not a long trip, not a risk, just a familiar stretch of road she had taken before. There was nothing unusual about the decision. No change in behavior, no urgency, no reason to think anything was different. And that normality would later become one of the most important details. Because when investigators looked back, they didn't see a turning point. They saw continuity. Jody had not stepped into something unknown. She had remained inside her own routine. Which raised a harder question. If nothing changed in her behavior, then what changed in the environment around her? The area around Woodinville in 1972 was quiet by design. The road felt private, which meant strangers were noticed, but no one remembered seeing one. People recognized passing cars. They noticed unfamiliar movement, which meant something else. Strangers stood out. That mattered for investigators, because if someone unknown had been waiting on that road, there was a chance someone would remember. But early checks showed nothing unusual. No reports of suspicious vehicles. No unfamiliar individuals seen nearby. The road itself was part of Jody's normal route. She had traveled similar stretches before. There was no reason to think that day would be different. No reason to anticipate interruption. And yet, something entered that environment without leaving a clear trace. No forced encounter. No visible escalation. Just a moment that broke pattern without warning, which introduced the first instability in the case. If the setting was predictable and Jody's routine was consistent, then whatever happened did not rely on chaos. It relied on opportunity. Jody left home during the day. The timing was ordinary. Daylight, clear conditions. Nothing that would restrict visibility. She was last seen riding her bicycle along the rural roadway. No signs of urgency. No indication she felt unsafe. Her path followed a known direction. A route that offered few turns and limited access points. That detail would matter later. With few roads in or out, investigators hoped the suspect pool would be smaller. It narrows possibility. At some point along that road, the sequence changed. The bicycle stopped. There was no collision, no mechanical failure. No indication she chose to stop voluntarily. The placement suggested interruption, not gradual, immediate. And then, within a short distance from the road, her body was found, positioned away from direct view, not hidden completely, but not visible unless someone moved closer, which meant something else. The event was quick. There was no extended movement across distance, no prolonged interaction that left visible disturbance. Just a short disruption, a separation from the road, and silence. No one reported hearing a struggle. No one described seeing a vehicle stop. No one placed another person at the scene. They could track where she went. They still couldn't explain what happened, but no explanation, which led directly to the first break in the story. How does a moment happen in daylight on a known road without producing a single clear witness? The bicycle should have explained something. Instead, it raised more questions. There were no signs of impact, no bent frame, no damaged wheel, no scattered items. It had not been crashed. It had been left. That distinction mattered because it suggested control. Something caused Jody to stop without destroying the object that carried her there. And then there was the location. She was found just off the road, not far enough to suggest relocation, not close enough to be immediately visible. It was a narrow placement, which raised a contradiction. If this was sudden, how was there enough control to move her off the road? And if it was controlled, why was there no trace of that control, no witness, no sound, no vehicle seen entering or leaving? Whatever happened seemed both sudden and controlled. Two elements that don't usually align, and that contradiction would define the early investigation. Because it meant one thing: this was not random chaos. It was something more deliberate, but deliberate actions usually leave patterns. Here, the pattern was missing. Once Jody was reported missing, the response moved quickly. Family members recognized the delay. She had not returned when expected. That broke routine. Search efforts began along her known routes. It didn't take long to locate the bicycle. That became the first fixed point. From there, attention shifted outward. Officers expanded the search radius. And then they found her. The discovery confirmed the worst outcome. But it did not clarify the event. Early interviews produced very little. No one reported seeing Jody stop. No one recalled hearing anything unusual. No one described another person interacting with her, which created pressure on investigators. Because the absence of witnesses removes direction. It forces reliance on physical evidence, and in this case, the evidence was limited. The location offered few traceable leads. The road did not produce clear tire impressions. There were no obvious items left behind by another person. No immediate suspect emerged, and that lack of direction shaped the early approach. Investigators began working outward from possibility. Was it a passing driver, someone familiar with the area, someone who had seen her before? Each theory introduced a path, but none produced confirmation, which left the case in an unstable position. Investigators had a victim and a scene, but nothing leading clearly to a suspect. The most important evidence wasn't dramatic, but it lasted. It did not explain the crime immediately, but it remained. Jody had been shot. That detail established one critical point: distance. This was not a close physical struggle. It introduced space between victim and offender, and space changes behavior. It reduces noise, reduces contact, reduces trace, which helped explain part of the silence, but not all of it. Because even with distance, presence still exists. Someone had to be there, and that presence left almost nothing behind. No identifiable weapon recovered at the scene. No clear personal items linked to another individual. No direct witness placing anyone nearby. The bicycle remained the strongest visual anchor. Even lying in the road, the bicycle remained the clearest marker of where everything changed. It marked the exact moment of interruption, a point where normal routine ended. But it did not point forward. It did not lead investigators to a person. Instead, it marked absence, and that absence extended across years. Because while the evidence confirmed what happened, it refused to explain who made it happen, which created a gap that traditional investigation could not close. In the absence of a clear suspect, detectives faced two troubling possibilities: a stranger no one remembered, or someone local, nobody noticed. Both explanations were dangerous, because if the killer was passing through, he could be anywhere. And if he was local, he may have been hiding in plain sight. Investigators first considered a passing offender, someone driving through, someone who saw opportunity, someone who left before being noticed. It explained the suddenness, but it had weaknesses, because passing offenders often leave patterns elsewhere. Other incidents, other reports, other connections, none appeared, so investigators were forced back to the second possibility. Someone local, someone familiar with the road, someone who understood the timing and privacy of that stretch. But that theory created a different problem. Local people are remembered, cars are noticed, routines are known, and yet, no one identified anyone unusual. The case remained trapped between two explanations. Neither could be proven, neither could be ruled out. As time passed, the gaps became more defined. The lack of witnesses stopped being temporary. It became permanent, which increased the weight on the timeline. Investigators revisited the sequence repeatedly, looking for missed details, small inconsistencies, anything that could shift direction. But the core structure remained unchanged. Jody left home. She rode along the road. Something interrupted her. And then, nothing. No follow-up movement, no extended trail, no confirmed interaction. Even the environment resisted explanation. The road did not support heavy traffic. It did not encourage random stopping, which made the passing offender theory less stable over time. At the same time, no local suspect emerged. No one's behavior stood out strongly enough. No evidence tied a specific person to the scene, which created a deeper contradiction. The event required presence, but presence could not be placed, and without placement, suspicion could not settle. The case began to drift. Not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked direction, and once direction is lost, time begins to work against resolution, which is exactly what happened. The case went cold. Not solved, not closed, just unanswered. For nearly half a century, the case of Jody Loomis did not move. It did not evolve. It simply existed in a frozen state of unanswered questions. Detectives had done everything the system of 1972 allowed them to do. They followed leads that led nowhere. They interviewed people who remembered nothing. They preserved what little evidence remained and waited for a breakthrough that never came. And then, the case was effectively left behind, not solved, not closed, just abandoned by time. For decades, that was where it stayed, until the investigation was reopened with something that did not exist when Jody was killed. A method that didn't rely on witnesses, or memories, or even direct evidence. It relied on something far more distant, genetic genealogy. At first, there was no obvious breakthrough. No name suddenly appeared. No suspect was instantly revealed. Instead, what investigators saw was something subtler and far more unsettling. A pattern, a distant biological connection buried inside old forensic material, linking the unknown offender not to a face, but to a family line. It wasn't identification, it was reconstruction. Piece by piece, investigators began narrowing an invisible circle around a person who had never been in their system. Not because he was unknown to the world, but because he had never been connected to the crime in any way the original investigation could detect. And then slowly, that circle tightened. One branch of the family tree began to stand out. One line that aligned too precisely with time, with place, with opportunity. And at the center of it was a name that had never appeared in 1972, Terrence Miller. He wasn't a new suspect. He was an old man who had lived an ordinary life in the same region where Jody died. He had never been charged, never been questioned in any meaningful way. Never placed inside the frame of the original investigation. But now for the first time the evidence was pointing toward him. Not as a possibility, but as a convergence point. A single individual where multiple genetic paths collapsed into one answer. And suddenly, A case that had been silent for 46 years shifted in a way it never had before. Because this time investigators were no longer asking what might have happened. They were asking something much more dangerous. What if the answer had been here all along, and no one had been able to see it? And once that question appeared, the entire case stopped being about the past. It became about confirmation. Terrence Miller was not a name that had surfaced during the original investigation. He had not been identified as a suspect. He had not been publicly connected to the case, which raised a critical issue. Not failure of evidence, but limitation of method. In 1972, investigative tools relied heavily on direct matches. Fingerprints, witness identification, immediate connections. If those failed, cases stalled. Miller existed outside those systems, not because he was invisible, but because there was no direct path to him. Genealogy changed that. It allowed investigators to reconstruct relationships, to identify individuals not by their own records, but by the records of others connected to them. And that approach revealed something important. The offender had not been random. He had been local, close enough to exist within the same environment, but distant enough from suspicion to avoid detection. That combination had protected him for decades, until the structure of the investigation changed. And once it did, the case shifted from unknown to increasingly specific, which brought investigators to the final stage, confirmation. Investigators approached Terrence Miller in 2018. By then, he was elderly. The timeline between the crime and the confrontation had stretched across nearly half a century. But the evidence had not disappeared. It had waited. When confronted, Miller confessed. Not through a prolonged trial, not through contested evidence, but directly. A statement that aligned with the investigation. A statement that closed the central question. He had been there. He had stopped her. He had committed the act. And then he had left. But there was one reason the answer still felt incomplete. Miller was near the end of his life. There would be no extended legal process, no full courtroom examination. The resolution came quickly, and then it stopped. Because shortly after confessing, he died, which meant the case reached confirmation, but not full judicial closure, and that distinction would shape the ending. Terrence Miller was identified as the offender. He confessed to the crime. But there was no trial, no conviction delivered through court proceedings. His death followed shortly after the confession, which meant the case closed through admission, not through prosecution. For investigators, the outcome provided resolution. For the family, it provided answers. But the legal system did not complete its process. There was no sentencing, no formal judgment delivered in court. The case was cleared, but not concluded in the traditional sense. And that difference remained, because justice in this case arrived late, and when it arrived, it was incomplete. The bicycle is still the clearest image, a simple object, left on a quiet road, marking the exact point where everything changed. For decades, it was the only thing anyone could picture clearly from that day. Not the details of the investigation, not the names that came later. Just that moment frozen in place. An ordinary ride interrupted, and then nothing after it. It represented a question, more than a memory. A scene without explanation. A life that ended without anyone there to fully understand how it happened in real time. And for the people closest to her, that silence lasted far longer than the crime itself. It stretched across years, becoming part of daily life. Something unresolved that never stopped existing in the background. Now it represents something different. Not closure in the way people expect, but something closer to understanding. Jody Loomis did not vanish into uncertainty. Her name did not fade into an unsolved file forever. There was eventually an answer, a name, a conclusion to the investigation. But what cannot be returned is time. The years between the moment it happened and the moment it was understood are still gone. No explanation can restore them. No resolution can move them back into place. And the quiet road where it all happened still exists, still narrow, still lined with trees, still holding the same silence it always did. But it no longer carries the same question, because now what happened there is known, and what remains is the distance between knowing it and having been able to change it. In the end, the road finally gave up its secret, far too late to change what it took, and that is the part that cannot be repaired.